Hello everyone, I am your host, the Sea Monster, and welcome to my essay video series on Shin Godzilla. Shin Godzilla was released in 2016 by Toho. It was directed by Hideaki Anno and Shinji Higuchi, and is a reboot in the Godzilla franchise. It also happens to be the first film in what is considered to be the Reiwa era of Godzilla films. Shin Godzilla was fairly, if not highly, anticipated by fans due to it being the return of Godzilla films from Toho and straight out of Japan. Just to give a little background, I wasn't really all that excited about this one leading up to its eventual release. The first trailer for it didn't really sell me on it, and I felt that it wasn't even necessary in concept considering how I was perfectly content and satisfied with the Godzilla reboot that came out just a couple years prior. When I got around to finally giving Shin Godzilla a shot and sitting down and watching it, after it was all said and done, all I could do was find reasons for why I hated it. I found it to be a very frustrating experience and a fruitless effort by Toho to reboot the Godzilla franchise on their end and to usher in a new era for the franchise. Years later, however, I decided to give it a second watch through. It was intended for a retrospective video that I've done for it, as well as the anime trilogy by Polygon on my GeForce 784 page. I found myself still disliking it, though to not as harsh or strong of a degree as before. I don't consider Shin Godzilla to be a terrible film objectively, but there are several aspects in it that cause it to fall frustratingly short and turn out as not a good film, despite what many folks out there may say. And that is what I'll be discussing here. What doesn't work in Shin Godzilla as well as what does work, while using other works in the Godzilla franchise as references to back up my points, in order to come to a conclusion on the film's overall quality. So, now that we have laid out what I'll be doing from here on out, let's begin. To start things off, let's get right into the story and characters in Shin Godzilla. The basic gist in the film is that a mysterious radioactive monster, later dubbed as Godzilla, surfaces and attacks Japan, and so we follow the politicians and their efforts to quell this new threat, while having to trudge through hurdles of red tape which only hinder their efforts. Now, it's worth noting that this film was made as a result of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, both of which occurred back in 2011, much like how the original Godzilla from 1954 was inspired by the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. It was also made as a response to the Japanese government's handling of the 2011 incidents. A fairly inspired attempt by this film to reintroduce Godzilla for new audiences considering the franchise's origins. A key thing to note as to why this is inspired is due to the fact that this is a reboot of Godzilla that takes him right back to his 1954 socio-political roots, while putting a modern spin on it in order to discuss more current events. However, the film falls short in a big way when it comes to how it goes about in its storytelling and character work. First of all, the film puts emphasis on the political elements in the Godzilla franchise more so than perhaps any other Godzilla film that had come prior. And that even includes the 1954 Godzilla film as well as Return of Godzilla from 1984. Having a Godzilla film be more of a political thriller with showcasings of some procedural elements would make for a compelling film on paper. Unfortunately, the film falls frustratingly short on that, due to how it handles its characters, which we'll get more in-depth on shortly. Just to preface that statement, however, I will say this. Without compelling or strongly written characters, investment in the political procedural aspects of the film starts to dwindle. Not only that, but the film's plot hinges on the characters using origami as a means to find a way to stop Godzilla via a formula for a coagulant created by Dr. Goromaki, a character who mysteriously disappeared off screen before the main events of the film, who was thought to be crazy in the eyes of his peers due to his research on the effects of radiation on the creature that he would go on to dub in his research as Godzilla. It's also stated that he was adamantly against the use of nuclear power, to put it lightly. So, it would be very understandable for him to disapprove of the United States turning to dropping nukes on Japan in order to stop the radioactive Godzilla. While the film subtly features some origami in the very first scene as a way to foreshadow its prominence to come later on, the way the film tries to come back around to it by having the characters use it in order to solve their chemistry problem is pretty contrived. Maki's expectations were put on our heroes to know how to do origami in order to uncover his research as some sort of test for the people of Japan, even though the fate of the whole nation of Japan, thus millions of lives, was at stake. It's made, at least fairly, apparent that Goro Maki would want the people of Japan to succeed in order for himself to be validated about the matter of Godzilla. Hence why he had his formula laid out, even if it was all jumbled up in a big mess that would require it all to be folded up in a particular way. The reason why this is so contrived is because if there wasn't a single person in that room with Yaguchi or everyone else working with him who knew how to do origami, the test would have resulted in failure. Therefore, all of his research would be in vain. Didn't think too far ahead on that one, did you, buddy? So, there's some problematic parts to Shin Godzilla already, but let's go a bit deeper into it, shall we? Now, let's get into the film's characters, or at least the more prominent ones. Since the film has so many human characters, many of whom only serve minor roles that play into their respective aspect of the film's plot, whether it's the military personnel who operate in directly attacking Godzilla, the politicians trying to traverse through red tape, or researchers looking for a way to stop Godzilla, I think we should narrow things down to the small number of human characters whom the film puts the most focus on, or the characters whom the film even bothers to give any sort of depth. First, we have Rando Yaguchi, the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary in the Japanese administration. He is the character whom we spend the most time following. Unfortunately, we aren't given much of a glimpse on him as a person. There are quite a few questions that could be raised about Rando here, such as, what made him so devoted to politics? Does he have a personal stake in this whole matter regarding Godzilla? Does he have a family? Wife? Is he a single father? I ask all these questions because despite the film's efforts to get us as an audience endeared to him, Rando Yaguchi is very lacking. It's not to say that we need a whole biography of this guy, but something beyond him expressing a level of interest in taking on the role of Prime Minister one day. While that does serve as a bit of a parallel to Kyoko and Patterson wanting to go from being the special envoy for the President of the United States to being elected as President, it's still not enough to fully flesh Rando out. He's clearly dedicated to his work, considering how he literally works day and night in order to save his country. But why is he so dedicated? This kind of dedication would have to come from somewhere, not just to save his country. So while Rando may not be the most poorly executed of the major characters in Shin Godzilla, he's perhaps the one with the least depth to him. In other words, I don't find him to be all that compelling of a protagonist. The second human character we have that is of a fair deal of significance is Kyoko Ann Patterson. Patterson serves as a representative for the United States of America. More specifically, she is the President's special envoy, being sent to discuss with Rando and company about the collaboration between the US and Japanese governments in dealing with Godzilla. She aspires to become POTUS one day, as previously mentioned. Now, even though she has less screen time than Rando, Patterson also, and interestingly so, has a little more to her respective character. She had grandparents who actually were around to witness the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the thought of another atomic bomb on Japan being taken into serious consideration and becoming a reality is heartbreaking to her, as we are shown in a scene at some point later in the film. Patterson has a personal stake in wanting Godzilla defeated before the US could take matters into its own hands. She doesn't want her generation to endure what had happened to her grandparents' generation. If there's any character who probably should have been the primary focus, it would have to be Patterson. Honestly, if we had combined her character traits with Rando Yaguchi's and with a little bit of script doctoring, she could be a fairly solid protagonist. Okay, let me put it this way. Kyoko Ann Patterson has or had a family who was affected by the nuclear bombings of World War II. So, if she was in Rando's position, right down to doing a prayer in front of the wreckage of Godzilla's first appearance, which would be given a more profound context in terms of how much these events regarding Godzilla would hit her right where she lives, then we could have had ourselves some groundwork for a really compelling and strongly written character. For you see, there are aspects of Patterson and even Rando to an extent that could have been salvaged if the writers had just put a little more thought into it. I basically was pulling some of these ideas right off the top of my head as I was writing the script. So it's rather perplexing that a professional writing team didn't consider this as a possible way to streamline the film. That is, if they hadn't thought of it already. Regardless, some of the ideas that I put forward certainly would have helped this film put its right foot forward in regards to solving its issues with its human characters. I understand that Shin Godzilla would need a big human cast considering the subject matter which it deals with, but it could have done more with the human characters whom it bothered to give some kind of story. So now let's get into the third significant human character of this film that I would say is worth addressing, the Prime Minister. The character whose actions and inactions throughout his screen time is what the film features as a springboard for its political commentary. The PM, along with his administration as a whole, is presented as ineffectual despite being well-meaning. This was done to represent how ineffectual the leadership in Japan was at the time of the real-life disasters which inspired this film. The issue, though, is that we aren't given any idea of how the PM and his administration perform in a more routine atmosphere, when there isn't a huge or even unprecedented calamity occurring, such as the emergence of a kaiju like Godzilla. We aren't given any context of how the public views the PM prior to the main events of the film. We're just thrusted right into the event just happening. We could have been presented with, perhaps, a news broadcast, just to fit in line with how the film features such broadcasts, as a way to convey how the PM is received by the public. Or we could have a scene where certain members of the PM's admin are discussing with him about his ratings or how the public is receiving certain legislations. These could happen either before the scene on the boat or even just right before the general public and the admin start catching wind about the goings-on at the coastline where the boat is. The film gravely missed an opportunity to really flesh the PM and his administration out in a way that could give us an understanding of either how strong or weak their leadership is under normal circumstances, so that there can be a compare and contrast to how they respond to Godzilla and his initial attack. And as for how the PM does when he is finally put in the position where he could potentially turn things around and stop Godzilla, boy howdy is there quite a bit to unpack here. When the PM orders the military to abort the mission to try to stop Godzilla during his first attack due to one of the pilots noticing just two people walking in a street, seemingly away from Godzilla, it all comes off like he is an absolute idiot. But not in a way that benefits the film, but rather in a way that is a detriment to it. We are clearly shown the carnage and destruction that Godzilla causes once he makes landfall, and the PM has no reason to think that the monster doesn't already have blood on his stubby little hands. Civilian blood, not the blood that was gushing out of his gills earlier. So him deciding to completely abort the mission when he has no reason to do so, when he can clearly see and comprehend with a crystal clear understanding that not taking any sort of offensive action against Godzilla at that point in time would be boneheaded, is a decision that would baffle anyone as to how and why he ever got elected in the office. Again, this could have been fixed with some extra scenes where we could have seen how he does during a routine day on his job, or we could have had an establishment of his reputation prior to this film's events. We also could have had an opportunity to see just how thick Godzilla's hide is by a showcasing of how rounds or rockets from various helicopters can't take him down, or at least not so easily. Basically, even when the preservation of human lives depends on the success of the people seeking to protect those lives, it's still better to try and fail than to not try at all. The Prime Minister, much like the film itself ironically, comes off as an individual who means well, but doesn't really know how to get his job done effectively, and it's even to a baffling degree when there were much better ways where the writers could have had this kind of story go on, while also having it make logical sense. There are better ways for the PM to be put in a position that challenges his values and principles, while also not making him a complete dolt. So, taking into consideration my points here, I am sure that defenders of Shin Godzilla will go on to say that the film has a message that it wants to say, and that perhaps I am not giving it the benefit of the doubt, and taking some of the PM's decisions, for instance, as an allegory to decisions made by real-life political figures. In the real-life events, the Tohoku tsunami and earthquake, and the Fukushima nuclear accident, were both fast-acting disasters, occurring in a compounding manner one after another. Godzilla, as presented in Shin Godzilla, is a big, lumbering monster that, for all the PM and the military know, could be killed if a couple gunners were to just pump his head full of lead. Now sure, a counterpoint could be made that Godzilla is bulletproof anyways, but that isn't made as a matter of fact until after his first attack. This is during his first attack, and there should be no reason for why the PM couldn't have at the very least tried. The film has a pretty clear agenda to condemn the government of Japan for its over-reliance on foreign powers and for how ineffective it was at responding to certain disasters. I understand that the film has a message that it wants to get across, and that it has good intentions in getting that message across, but the delivery of said message isn't well executed. There is poor writing in place in order to contrive a means to get that message across. There are plenty of films with poor writing out there that have messages that they want to say, no matter how well the mechanics in their scripts function. Let me give you all an example. Godzilla's Revenge, also known as All Monsters Attack. That film has a very clear message about how one must stand up to adversity, such as bullying as presented in that film's case. However, the mechanics in that film lead it to where, during the very last scene, the main kid character, Ichiro, messes with another person's livelihood in order to be friends with the kids who were bullying him earlier. Ichiro had undergone an arc where he had to learn to stand up for himself and overcome his form of adversity, only to put another person through adversity as a way to win over his former bullies. Press F for the painter. Granted, that's not the only problem with Godzilla's Revenge, because that is a bottomless can of worms that I am not prepared to open at this time. The point here is that Godzilla's Revenge has a message that it wants to say and even teach to younger audiences, but the film is so blissfully unaware of how contradictory the mechanics in its writing are that it fails its own message as a result. In contrast, to highlight how to do a film with a socio-political message well, we have Godzilla 1954. In that film, we have characters that are consistently written throughout its runtime based on how they make decisions that make sense with who they are, with Dr. Daisuke Serizawa being the strongest example in that bunch as a character who makes a tragic sacrifice by the end, based on what he has experienced, such as the horrors of nuclear testing and warfare as demonstrated by Godzilla, as well as what he is aware that could happen if he were to live on, such as people asking him to replicate the creation of his own invention that could cause untold destruction should it fall into unscrupulous hands. It also has a story which features a message about the consequences of discovering and creating new devices of a deadly nature that serves as an allegory for real-life historical events that is all held together by a strong script that flows in a coherent and logical manner. By having writing that is sound on a mechanical level, Godzilla 1954 is able to stand with as much reverence as it does today. So, when the makers of Shin Godzilla tried to replicate what the 1954 film did, but with a different historical context and allegory without really understanding why that older film works as well as it does, their hearts may very well be in the right place. But the film's overall quality still falls short as a result of how poorly handled certain key aspects of its script are. I won't deny that Shin Godzilla still resonated with enough people due to its allegories, and I don't fault people for wanting a film that speaks to them. But let's not shy away from the fact that a film can do that while also being well written. And unfortunately, in the case of Shin Godzilla, the well written part is left to be desired. So, we've spent a good chunk of time on the human characters, despite how limited and lacking they are in terms of depth or characterization, and we have gone over the thematic core of the film for what it's worth. So now, let's take a look at the big G-Man himself and see how he stacks up, because if nothing else, surely the film would do its title monster justice, right? Well, let's get into that, shall we? Godzilla is presented as a mysterious giant creature that suddenly rose from the sea and is capable of mutating at will in order to counteract various attempts on his life. His mutations go from altering his body structure to where he can go more upright, to shooting beams of atomic energy from places that aren't his mouth. We are even given a chilling hint of him attempting to produce smaller humanoid variants of himself from the tip of his tail in what may have been a last-ditch effort to live on before the coagulant could work its magic. Now, in many Godzilla films, if not all of them, we have a general understanding of who and what Godzilla is as a character. In the 1954 film, he's an animal reacting out of rage against humanity due to nuclear bomb testings and targets Japan as a result. In later Showa-era films, he seeks to protect his home from other monsters that seek to claim it as their own and/or destroy it. In Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, he's looking for and is seeking to protect his son from what he may perceive as his captors. In GMK, he is an embodiment of the vengeful souls of people killed by Japan during the Pacific conflict when the country seeks to shy away from that history. In the Monsterverse, he is an apex predator whose duty is to maintain balance in the Earth's natural order by any means necessary. Those examples show that Godzilla is usually depicted as a monster with a goal and a sense of purpose, easy to understand and follow. Meanwhile, in Shin Godzilla, we are given a Godzilla who doesn't seem to have any clear goal in mind other than just go to Japan and cause some mayhem there, just because there wouldn't be a movie if he doesn't. He certainly comes off as a creature that will do whatever is necessary for the sake of going onward and for his self-preservation, but we are never given any understanding as to what end. There is one hint at Godzilla's characterization, and that is in a song entitled Who Will Know, which is a part of the film's soundtrack. This song plays when Godzilla gives Tokyo what is essentially a big laser light show of death. On its own, it's a good piece of music that exudes a tragic mood. However, I take issue with how the song is incorporated into the film itself. In order to understand why, here are the lyrics for Who Will Know, and they go as follows. If I die in this world, but I must carry on, who will know something of me? Nothing worse can befall. I am lost, no one knows. All my fears, all my tears. There's no tracing of my yearning. Tell my heart there's a hole. I were void, as long as breath comes from my mouth. Not even hope. I may yet stand the slightest chance. A downward slope, a shaft of light is all I need, is all I see, to cease the darkness killing me. The lyrics for this song detail how Godzilla is a tortured character, tortured by his own existence and how outside forces won't be able to understand him when they try to kill him. This is meant to put this version of Godzilla in somewhat of a sympathetic light. While some, perhaps even many, would call this a pretty effective way to get across Godzilla's character, I, however, have to contest that and say that it is not. Just because the music is trying to tell us what's happening, that doesn't mean that what we're shown corresponds to or supports what we're being told. If Godzilla is supposed to be seen as a tortured soul longing to be understood, as the song suggests, then why are we deliberately shown him retaliating against human attacks, whether it's firing lasers out of practically every orifice in his body out of self-defense, or through mutating himself and even attempting to reproduce smaller Godzilla-like humanoids as shown in the last shot of the film. While a sentient creature would have a tendency to commit some form of self-defense if it's aware that its life is at stake, Godzilla, intended to be a character in of himself, is still shown to be actively defending himself and relying on his survival instinct as if he has a goal in mind where his own survival is key. But even if we take the song outside of context with what we are shown, there is still another problem. Not only is this song implemented in a way as a shortcut in giving us an idea of what this version of Godzilla is as a character, and not even a well-executed shortcut at that, but the lyrics aren't even comprehensible in the scene itself. And no, the issue doesn't relate to language barriers. It relates to how this song was placed in the wrong moment. If the sound of Godzilla going on his atomic rampage is cut out, then the lyrics would be much more clear, but the cutting out of sound would be off-putting for plenty of folks out there who would like to see and hear Godzilla's attack in full glory. Heck, even I would admit that I would probably find it to be off-putting if they did that. So perhaps this song should have been placed at a different point in the film entirely, like, let's say, at the end when the coagulant that gets pumped into him starts to work its magic. That way, when he is shown to be dying, or as it may seem, the song would at least lend to the tragedy of Godzilla being a creature in a constant state of sorrow and pain, due to his own existence, as he is forced to endure a slow, painful death at the hands of people who would never try to really understand him. As things are, however, Who Will Know is a good song that deserved a better handling than what it got, and perhaps even deserves to be in a better Godzilla movie, period, but oh well. When it's all said and done, while Godzilla, as presented in this film, fares better in the character side of things than his human co-stars, he still shares similar problems in his characterization and is still a far cry from his potential. So that's just gonna have to do for this part of my essay video series on Shin Godzilla. Stay tuned for part 2, where I will be looking at how the film does in the technical side of things, and then come to an overall conclusion on the whole thing. Thank you for watching, and until the next part of this series, I will see you all later.